whether it's the first possession of a game or the first possession of the second half, there's not a lot of difference. I mean, at second half, you do go in, you make adjustments, what has been working, what hasn't, why. You talk about it really fast, but you also stick to your guns. Hey, we game planned this. This is what they're showing. This is what we still need to call, and that's basically it, as far as what the coach's mindset.
That voice you just heard was Nebraska offensive coordinator Matt Lubick discussing the Huskers' struggles in the second half so far. Through 3 games, Nebraska's scored a total of 6 points in the final 30 minutes of those games. Believe it or not, we are already into the second half of Nebraska's football schedule in this bizarre season. And for the Huskers to be better, the 4 remaining games all look more even than I guess the first 3 did. Nebraska was an underdog in all 3 of those games. Came out of it 1-2, which I'm not sure anybody totally expected. Well, I'm not sure anybody expected them to be underdogs in those first 3, much less to play only 3 instead of 4. But here we are. And for Nebraska to be better over the second half of the season, man, it still seems so strange to say after 3 games. They're going to have to be better in the final 30 minutes. How do they do that? What's the actual issue here? It's not an easy question to answer, but we'll get into that. We'll highlight some key players on both sides and break down exactly what Nebraska needs to do to beat Illinois on Saturday. You're listening to the I-80 Preview Podcast. I'm Hale Varsity Managing Editor Brandon Vogel. Let's talk some football. We'll kick off the first half here by the same way we do every first half each week, by looking at the wise guys, what the wise guys' wisdom has to say about Huskers Illini. Barring total chaos over the second half of the season, Nebraska's probably not going to be a bigger favorite against any team this season than it is on Saturday against Illinois. That probably an unnecessary qualifier. They're not going to be. I mean, there's just not enough games to make up that much ground. Circa Sports opened this line at Nebraska -14 on Sunday. Shout out again to Circa Sports. This should really be a sponsor on the show, actually, now that I talk about it. For getting those lines out first at -14. The line's gone up since then. By midweek, you could find it at Nebraska -15.5 to Nebraska -16 in terms of where the public has put its money for this game. They've put it on Nebraska for the most part. Or I guess it's even not entirely accurate to assume that a few big money bettors this early in the week can move that line kind of by themselves. But either way, whether it's smart money or the most money, the line's gone up from what it opened at. So you're looking at Nebraska by more than 2 touchdowns in this game. I don't know if you're surprised by that or not. As we get into the power rankings, which can often serve as a little bit of a check on this, they're kind of saying the same thing. SP Plus, the house power rankings of the I-80 Preview Podcast, for lack of a better term, would make Nebraska about a 15-point favorite on Saturday, and that's factoring in a 2-point home field advantage, which is down from about the 2.5 to 3 you would in a normal season. You do that obviously for the lack of a traditional home field atmosphere. I mean, Nebraska's not even on the same sideline they usually are, though it sounds like that might be a 1-year aberration. Anyway, back to SP Plus. Nebraska ranked 35th this week, which is down 1 spot, but it had a rating of 7.7, which is up 1/10 of a point. How does that happen? After a win, one of the beauty of SP Plus in my eyes is that it really rewards playing well. It doesn't care whether you win or lose, which might seem counterintuitive on its face, but in terms of what's replicable and what's sustainable in a purely football context, like how well you play is often more important than, I mean, it's not more important in a real world sense. In a real world sense, all that matters are wins and losses. But in terms of what you're able to do next week, which is all SP Plus is intended to be, it is not intended to be a resume ranking. It's intended to be a predictive ranking. The goal there is to, I don't even know if it's the goal, but a good check on ranking systems such as this is how close is what they project for a margin in the game to the actual point spread. And we already talked about point spreads up to 15.5 at most places, at least as of this recording. And that's kind of where SP Plus was on Sunday when it updated its rankings based on the previous week. So Nebraska beat Penn State and didn't get a huge move at all, either way, up or down, in the SP Plus rankings. And that's really how it's designed. Nebraska got a big move last week when it lost, but played well against Northwestern. This week, this past week, the most recent game, it played okay. It got the win. It got one defensive score and another score basically set up by the defense. But Penn State was more efficient. It was more explosive. It had more scoring chances. The majority of the time, a team doing those things will win that game. And that's no shame on Nebraska. That's not to downplay the quality of the win. The most important thing was the Huskers just needed a win. And we've talked about that on this show before. So getting one after multiple cases, not just one or two, but you're talking 5, 6, 7, where Nebraska has been on the other end of that, where they've played like the team that should have won and didn't. Getting one back here isn't cheap in any regard, but that's kind of what those rankings are saying. So look at that, pull that up. Close follower.
A Hurrdat Media Production.
Well, Nebraska dropped a spot despite winning. How does that work? It kind of works like that. Like they dropped a spot because other teams grew by more. Their ranking increased by more. Nebraska's ranking went up just very slightly, which feels like a pretty true result for that game. So SP Plus would have it at Nebraska minus 15. Illinois comes into the game, and they jumped a little bit too after the win over Rutgers. They're ranked 90th in SP Plus rankings, minus 5.4. So SP Plus is saying the Illini are basically 5.5 points worse than the average college football team so far in 2020. FPI, Football Power Index, ESPN's other power ranking system, is a little bit more reactive than SP Plus tends to be on a week-to-week basis. Nebraska's win over Penn State there was worth a 10-spot jump in the rankings. So the Huskers are up to number 32. Illinois is 83rd following the win over Rutgers, and they also increased from where they were at. So FPI would put this line at about Nebraska minus 12.5. I think the big takeaway here from both of those power rankings is just where Nebraska's at. 35th in SP Plus, 32nd in FPI. That's pretty good for a team that's 1-2. It's pretty good for a team that so far, at least to my eye, hasn't looked like it's drastically better than the previous versions of this team under Scott Frost. I thought this 2020 team would be. I thought this Nebraska team was poised for success. That's based on a lot of factors. Returning production, probably foremost among those. But the offense hasn't played like it hasn't improved like a team you would expect to improve when it returned its leading passer, who's perhaps no longer its primary passer in Adrian Martinez. Its top two rushers, again, Martinez, but also Dedrick Mills. He was number one on that list. And even through the loss of J.D. Spielman in the offseason, this was still an offense that you expected to improve. We're still kind of waiting for that to actually happen. Most of Nebraska's gains, and they've been slight on both sides, though. Most of those have been on the defensive side. That's the general setup here. Wherever you prefer to look, Nebraska's a double-digit favorite at home against Illinois, and that's not to be taken for granted. Nebraska probably wouldn't be a double-digit favorite over Maryland right now. It probably would be over Rutgers. So we looked at this schedule in the offseason, the schedule 3.0, the revision to the revised edition, I guess, for lack of a better term, and said, yeah, that's tough. And it is tough. Even Penn State, I know they're 0-4, but that's a team that's a challenge to play. And Nebraska was able to get it done. So you take that, you hope to build off of it. The coaches talked about it this week. More than one coach said they're riding the momentum wave, which you could also say about Illinois. It forced three second half turnovers to get that win at the gun, basically over Rutgers. And Illinois has been an interesting team under Lovie Smith. They obviously made their big jump last year, getting bowl eligible and beating Wisconsin, which kind of kicked off a nice little midseason win streak for them. But this team, it lost a good portion of returning production. It's probably not as strong as the Illini were in 2019. But that doesn't mean that Nebraska just rolls out of bed for this 11 a.m. kickoff and shows up and gets a win. Like, they're going to have to go out and do it. One thing you can give Lovie Smith is he attracts talent, and they kind of wax and wane based on the concentration of that talent. And this year's a little bit down compared to, well, certainly last year, but there's still some players that can hurt you on this squad. So let's go ahead and dive right into that with three key players to watch from the Illini side. Number one on my list is quarterback Isaiah Williams. Number one, you probably won't be able to miss him, though the Illini are in sort of a similar spot to Nebraska. They played 4 quarterbacks this year, which is a little bit insane. Scott Frost gave them some credit for that in his Monday press conference, depending on your point of view, somewhat subtly or maybe not so subtly, acknowledging that the Illini played through some the lack of availability for players due to COVID-19 testing. Whatever you make of that, they haven't had Brandon Peters, the Michigan transfer, who was their starter all last year and started their opening game this year. He tested positive and had to sit out the mandated amount from the Big Ten. He's back and available this week, so Illinois has him at their disposal. Lovie Smith was pretty, as most coaches would be in this scenario, pretty cagey about who's actually going to play. But Isaiah Williams was a huge recruiting win from the St. Louis area. 4-star recruit, was supposed to be sort of the future for the Illini at quarterback, and then they were able to land Peters as a Michigan transfer and went with him. So Williams maintained his red shirt while appearing in 4 games last year. In fact, he got his first career action against Nebraska last year. But he went off against Rutgers, rushed for 192 yards, set the school record for rushing yards from a quarterback, and earned the Big Ten Player of the Week honors on the offensive side of the ball. Nebraska has to account for him. He's 7 for 21 this year as a passer, so it's a pretty clear divide in terms of what Illinois can and hopes to do when he's in the game. He hurts you most as a runner, but he's very good in that aspect of his game, and Nebraska will have to have a solution for that. Number 2 on my list, linebacker James Hansen, number 35. I always love how football coaches have the freedom to refer to guys by numbers. maybe we'll start doing that here on the I-80 preview podcast. It'll be a little bit of coach stolen valor, I guess, for lack of a better term. But I always like that when you ask a coach a question and he's like, yeah, number 35, he's a good player. That is true of James Hansen. Pretty versatile guy. He can play inside linebacker. He can play outside linebacker. He's done both for Illinois this season. Ranks fourth on the Big Ten in tackles with 37 going into this week. He also has 4 tackles for loss. But the biggest thing is the crazy thing is he also has 2 forced fumbles this year, which shouldn't come as a surprise if you were paying close attention to Illinois football last year. Hansen had 7 forced fumbles in 9 games in 2019. Guy's just a playmaker. He's the kind of guy that, and I don't know how heavily recruited he was out of high school, but here as a senior, he's the kind of guy that any Big Ten team would take, which is a pretty big compliment when you consider the strength of the conference, and not just the strength of the conference in general, but the strength of the conference at linebacker. It is traditionally a very good linebacker league, and James Hansen is one of those. So keep an eye on number 35. Last on the list for players to watch for the Illini, I'm gonna go a little bit counter to maybe what most would think here and choose Brian Hightower. He's not the wide receiver most people probably first think of. That would be Josh Imatorbhebhe, former 5-star recruit who signed with USC out of high school, transferred to Illinois. That happens a lot under Smith during his tenure in Champaign-Urbana. He lures these guys who were highly touted prospects that for one reason or another didn't work out at their original school. So he's getting a little bit of a devalued asset to a degree, not in terms of talent. Like Illinois is not going out and signing a 5-star receiver, but they might get him on the rebound from a place like USC. And that was the case with Imatorbhebhe. He's the Illini's leading receiver, but I chose Hightower because he's a guy I think you need to keep an eye on. He made his Illinois debut in the opener against Purdue, and went for 97 yards and his lone touchdown on the season there. But the big news here is he's averaging more than 20 yards a catch, 21.5 yards per catch. And also like Imatorbhebhe, he is a former 4-star, so not quite the blue chip that his receiving mate was, but pretty close, who signed with Miami out of high school and then transferred to Illinois. And that's where you'll find him now. Let's flip it to the Nebraska side of the equation. To be completely honest, kind of identifying key players is a little bit more difficult with a game like this, where the spread is what it is. But we will soldier on here. Number one, in terms of Nebraska players to watch on Saturday for me is cornerback Cam Taylor-Britt. Had a really strong game against Penn State, 4 tackles. Of course, the interception that he returned down inside the Penn State red zone that directly led to points for the Huskers. And then you probably saw the photo of this, but a huge pass breakup in the red zone late in the game as Nebraska kind of stood up and stopped 8 straight Penn State pass attempts from inside the 15-yard line to win that game. Taylor-Britt is one of Nebraska's best players on either side of the ball. Like there's not much question in my mind that is the case. And last week he looked like it. Like I think almost everybody in Nebraska's secondary so far this season, he has a little bit of a problem with trying to make the highlight play when the simple play probably gets you more. But you work through that stuff, and I'm pretty interested to see if he can maintain that momentum this week, coming off a strong game against the Nittany Lions. When you look at Illinois' got two receivers that can really challenge you, and Taylor Britt's probably going to be matched up on one or the other on the majority of snaps. So he's got a little bit of a challenge here. We'll get more into just why that's such a challenge as we go on, but a game like this where you're a heavy favorite, like your best players should be able to perform like the best. And that's kind of the challenge facing Cam Taylor-Britt and a few others. Number 2 for this week would be inside linebacker Will Honus. Luke Reimer had a brilliant game against Northwestern, and Honus was a little bit dinged up, and Reimer came in and looked exactly like what he has been billed as so far, which is one of Nebraska's best athletes. Like, it's kind of amazing when you stop and think about, they got this guy a local kid to walk on, and immediately, not like 3 or 4 years down the road after he's been in the weight program, et cetera, but immediately just kind of looks like one of their best athletes. And that's a great thing. And there's a place for Luke Reimer. He's going to be on the field, but you got to give some credit to Will Honus here, senior linebacker, junior college transfer. Reimer played so well and was so all over the field and so impossible to miss that you kind of wondered, like, oh, Will Honus just, couldn't go this game because he's a little bit dinged up. And did he just lose his job? I think credit to the coaches and this is what most coaches would do, but it's tougher in practice than it is in the press conference of, no, you don't lose your job due to injury. And Will Honus responded. He came out and played really strongly against Penn State, had a career high 13 tackles against the Nittany Lions. So I mentioned him, but really the onus, I think, in this game is on Nebraska's linebacker group as a whole. Honus has to be good. Miller has to be good. Reimer's going to be in there. He's got to be good. And the collection of outside linebackers also are going to have to be strong, because this Illinois defense, it struggles on a down-to-down basis, but it is really strong in terms of big plays. Isaiah Williams, the quarterback that I mentioned earlier, he can hurt you in the running game. Running back Chase Brown, who is not their primary rusher, he's more of their big play guy. He can hurt you. And then those two receivers we've already talked about, Mater Bebe and Hightower. You let those guys get loose downfield, and they'll come up and make plays. They are talented players. So I think you start with an offense like that against the run. You've got to be able to contain Williams when he's in there. You can't let long runs happen. Nebraska had one of those early in the game last year, and kind of had to fight and scramble for its life and be really good offensively to come away with a win at Illinois next year. So Will Honus, the rest of the linebackers, they've got to be pretty sound and strong on Saturday to contain the big plays of the Illini. And if you do that, you're kind of suffocating that offense. It's not efficient enough so far through 3 games to really worry you that way. But you give up a bunch of big plays and things can get weird in a hurry. Third on my list for Nebraska is, we'll go to the offensive side, which maybe it's a little strange that I went 2 defensive guys to start, because offense is really kind of the sore spot for Nebraska after 3 games. And for that reason, I'm going with running back Dedrick Mills, but really it could be anybody from that running back room. And no, I don't mean, in this instance, Wan'Dale Robinson. So against Penn State, Mills got nicked up early and was basically out of the game. And Nebraska's response was to give the majority of the remaining carries that weren't handled by Luke McCaffrey to Wan'Dale Robinson. It was good and it was bad. It was good because it meant Robinson got some more touches. which everybody wanted going into that game, still averaged about 3 yards a carry, which is right where he was last year. It's a strange thing with Robinson, because almost like a lot of his runs look like they could go the distance if not for one tackle, but few of them actually do. And that's not a criticism of him. It's just for all the talk about Robinson needs to be a bigger part of the offense, it's not like Nebraska doesn't give him carries in one game and then does, and he goes nuts. So that's something to watch. I think the bigger thing, the bigger question for the sustainability of Nebraska football in 2020 and beyond is, can they get something from that running back spot? Nebraska's still good in terms of explosive plays, explosive rushing plays. It's still good in terms of efficiency running the ball, but a lot of that's coming through the quarterback spot at the moment, whether that's Martinez or McCaffrey. They're both capable runners, and I don't think that's exactly what you want to see. It's a little bit of nitpicking at this point. You'll take those big runs however they come, but I just go into this game thinking the Huskers need a little bit more out of the running back spot, and we'll see if we can get it. If it's not Mills, if by chance he's not fully healthy and isn't the guy who can go, then it's Ronald Tompkins or it's Marvin Scott III. Somebody back there has to be able to do some damage here, because this Illini defense, there's not a ton you can point to that it just flat does well at the moment. And Nebraska needs to be able to take advantage of that. And I think that starts with the run game so far. The passing game has been a struggle at times. So you got to go with your strength against a team you have an advantage against. You've got to be able to kind of lean on that. And that's going to require something from the running back spot. That brings us to halftime of the I-80 preview podcast. Halftime has sort of been the turning point for the Huskers so far in 2020. But don't worry, we'll get into that. First, here's Rusty Dawkins with your game day forecast for a Saturday in Lincoln.
This is meteorologist Rusty Dawkins with Hail Varsity for the I-80 preview podcast. And the forecast, well, it's not going to be brutally cold. It's not going to be very warm either. Temperatures will likely be in the 40s for much of the day on Saturday, before eventually cooling into the 30s by the early evening. But for much of the game, lower and middle 40s should just about do it. Now, those temperatures wouldn't be so bad, but there's always a but. With a disturbance right over the top of us on Saturday, rain is looking likely for much of the game, and temperatures are going to be a good 10 to 15 degrees above the freezing mark, so snow doesn't look to be an issue, but still is going to be a chilly rain, that's for sure. And if you are looking for some snow, there might be some mixing in late, but for the game it looks like it should just stay all rain. Now, this is a chilly and a rainy Husker game day, so the only thing that would make it worse would be a lot of wind, right? Thankfully, that doesn't look like it's going to be an issue. There will be a wind out of the northeast at 5 to 15 miles per hour, but that's kind of a given. So the wind won't be an issue, but it is going to be rainy and it is going to be cold. So that's enough. Here's your hour-by-hour forecast. Kickoff, rain is looking likely. Temperatures in the lower 40s by 11 a.m. Northeast wind around 5 to 15 miles per hour. Then at halftime, rain still likely, temperatures in the middle 40s, so we don't warm up much, and that northeast wind at 5 to 15. The rain sticks around by the end of the game, and temperatures will be in the middle 40s with the northeast wind still at 5 to 15 miles per hour. Now, I'll have updates on Hail Varsity, hailvarsity.com, and as well as on my Twitter accounts. That's RustyWX and Husker Weather.
Second half action is underway, and let's get right into it. How does Nebraska beat Illinois on Saturday? I think the first key that I will point to is Nebraska needs to remain patient on offense. This game sets up as an interesting one for the Huskers offensively. The Illini are not good on a down-to-down basis. Their success rate allowed so far this season is 49.8%. which is the eighth worst nationally. And it's not even unbalanced. It's not like the Illini are good at one thing and bad at the other. No, they're kind of equally bad at both. They're 113th in success rate against the run and 114th in success rate against the pass. So that kind of tells you that on a down by down, play by play basis, this is a defense that's really struggling to keep teams off schedule. That's good news. Good news for Nebraska, because despite its struggles on offense elsewhere, still ranks 38th or 35th, in overall success rate, ranks 13th in success rate on rushing plays, which is why I mentioned Mills and the rest of the running back crew. And when you're talking bigger picture with just success rate on rushing plays, go ahead and include the quarterbacks in that. The Luke McCaffrey against Penn State, it was an interesting debut for him because he didn't do anything at any point in that game to make you think, well, maybe they got to go back to Martinez for a drive. Like, the offense just isn't hitting it. It's not doing it. But from a numbers perspective, like, the offense was basically the same, actually a little bit worse, though maybe you credit that to Penn State. All of the coaches this week were effusive in terms of their praise for the talent level on that side of the ball for the Nittany Lions. But, Nebraska basically, like, the offense didn't take off under McCaffrey, I guess is the point. So overall, Nebraska's going to have to be able to run the ball well. It's going to have to be able to run the ball well, particularly because there's the allure of big plays here against Illinois. Well, the Illini are comparatively better in terms of limiting big plays. They're still not good. It's only in relation to what is a pretty atrocious defensive efficiency to this point in the season that the explosive play numbers look good. But the Illini rank 87th in explosive plays percentage allowed. So you kind of look at this game and think, well, maybe there are some plays there to be had. Maybe this is the game where the much maligned on the milk carton, totally missing downfield passing game shows up. And that's not faulty reasoning. There are reasons to think that could play out for the Huskers. Last year against Illinois, they had 21 explosive plays, both rushing and passing, which is, I've been tracking this on a game by game basis, live, real time, since I think 2014, and 21 is insane. Like, I can't think of any other game that was even close to that in terms of the number of big plays they had. JD Spielman had a really big game in terms of downfield catches against Illinois last year. He paid the price for it. If you remember that game at all, you can remember a number of big hits on JD Spielman, but he's not here. And Nebraska is lacking that threat, whether it's through development wide receiver, which remains a work in progress, whether it's wide receiver or quarterbacks missing wide receivers who are open, which has certainly happened a couple of times. But so far through 3 games, Nebraska's 88th in explosive plays percentage. The Nebraska offense is, which is a number I honestly never thought we'd probably see under Frost, but here they are. We knew coming in that there were some limitations in the receiver room. We knew at the very least that Nebraska was young. We haven't seen as much of those young guys as, professional pundits such as myself and others would have thought. And I think there are good reasons for that. I think there are reasons beyond what the coaches will say publicly for that. But whatever it is, you kind of have to trust their judgment on it. And it's hurting Nebraska. Not being able to stretch the field is a problem. Is it a problem against an Illinois defense that's struggling to stop teams down by down, but also somewhat susceptible to big plays? Maybe not. It would be a surprise if that really flipped in this game. But I think the thing that Nebraska has to avoid here is the temptation to quote unquote get right in this game. Like, do what you do, run the offense that you know you can execute, and you should probably be fine that way. And it may not be as fun or as interesting as people expect, given the 2 touchdown spread in this game, 2 touchdowns or more. But I really think that's Nebraska's best path to victory. It would be tough in my estimation to make a change at quarterback at this point. You know, the coaches say it's an open competition and we're going to continue to go week by week. And I think that's true to a degree, but to go back to kind of where we started this first point, McCaffrey didn't do anything to say, oh, I'm not up for this. Like the offensive numbers as a whole weren't better, but they also weren't worse. So you give him some manageable plays. You maybe take a couple extra shots, just knowing that, you know, no disrespect, but this is Illinois. It's not Penn State. And you see what happens and you adjust and go from there. So I think the overall point here is for Nebraska to do what it knows it does well, which is run the football at this point. Even if we haven't seen quite as much as we'd like to from the running backs so far, it seems much more likely to me that Nebraska's running backs look great in this game instead of all of a sudden, oh, they're hitting for 20 and 25-yard passes. I just don't know if the Huskers are ready for that. So patience is gonna be a big one for me. Nebraska's efficiency numbers, its success rate is going to be a bigger factor for me in this one than the number of big plays that it gets. The second thing Nebraska has to do to win this game is to sort of flip that first point on its head. Illinois is a big play offense at this point. They struggle with success rate, with down-to-down efficiency, but they are capable of hitting big plays. They rank 17th nationally in explosive plays percentage. Their 24 plays of 20 plus yards so far lead the Big Ten. Williams can hurt you with the run game. We already talked about the receivers. They got a couple of downfield threats. In a lot of ways, they kind of have to hope for those plays. We're going to chuck it downfield a couple of times each half and see what we get. And there's with the way college football games are called today, there's just a lot of upside for offenses to do that, because you can complete it or you can get a pass interference penalty. And even though it's only 15 yards instead of spot of the foul like it is in the NFL, that's still pretty significant. 15 yards on a passing play, even if it's via penalty, I wouldn't technically count it as an explosive play, but practically you're getting 15 yards there. It still counts. So it's going to be really important for Nebraska to keep a lid on things on Saturday. And that's, every defense wants to do that. Every defensive coordinator in the country knows just how big explosive plays are. Like, they dramatically increase the chances of scoring on a drive. So you got to avoid them at all costs. I guess the good news for Nebraska is coming off a pretty strong game in this regard against Penn State. Penn State had a slight edge in explosiveness, but overall, both teams, like, the win over Penn State was not a game defined by big plays. Penn State had a really big one to Pat Freiermuth, the tight end, went for 74 yards and got a touchdown on that. But for the most part, Nebraska was asking both the first half field goal drives took over 10 plays, which is good. Like, I understand this isn't kind of, the classic shutdown defense that any football fan would prefer. Like, you want to see your team going 3 and out, but if you can ask a team to drive 10, 11, 12 plays to just get a field goal, you're winning. And particularly with where this defense has been the previous 2 seasons, and I think where they're trying to get to, they're trying to craft a defense that will be paired with an offense that averages a lot more points than Nebraska has so far, which is, a separate issue. But in terms of executing that plan, Nebraska got a couple of takeaways last week against Penn State, made them drive the football. Nebraska won the field position battle, which is not all that common since the start of 2018. So it was good enough in that game. And when they got down to the red zone, you can look back at those final 2 Penn State drives, both of which ended inside the 15-yard line. And Nebraska stood up. Penn State didn't have the advantage of being able to settle for a field goal on those. And Nebraska did what it needed to do to get the stops to get a win. So that's all good. But when you think about this big picture wise, I did some research for this for the November issue of the magazine, which is out now. Subscribe if you haven't already and you want to read the in-depth column on this. But 7 is kind of a magic number for football drives, and it's a number not just as a magic number this year, but it's a number that holds steady pretty much year to year, which tells you that you're looking at something that's like, okay, this is a little bit of just how modern day football works. And the average touchdown drive in college football from 2018 to now is less than 7 plays. It's not much less. The average, I think, is about 6.7 or 6.8 plays. So you're right there. But the average drive that ends in a field goal is up over 9 plays. So when you're watching a game, this is kind of one of those like stat nerd things that if you just put it in the back of your head, you might be able to tell like how things are actually going versus, just looking at where a team is on the field, how much danger an offense or defense might be in. But when those drives get over 7 plays, like you're much more likely to end that drive in a field goal. And if you're going to go, like if you're on the field for 7, 8, 9 plays, like you're going to be in opponent territory. You might even be in the red zone the vast majority of the time. And that's okay. Like if you can get a field goal in the red zone, you'll take that every time. And that's what Nebraska did to Penn State. It's what it needs to do against Illinois. The 4 or 5 play touchdown drives, which the Illini had a couple of last year in a game that was closer than anybody imagined, are really a problem, but they're also pretty common in college football. That's how touchdown drives go. You get that big gain, you punch it in. As we saw with Penn State, we've talked a lot about this season, or certainly at least since the Northwestern game, about Nebraska's red zone struggles. And I think you can chalk a lot of that up to development at wide receiver. Nebraska's still working on the depth that it needs there. It's still looking for, I think, the playmakers that it needs there. You just need guys who can win one-on-one when quarters get tight. And I don't know if the group that Nebraska's putting out there can consistently do that yet. Penn State is a group where you would say they have 2 guys that can do that. Jahan Dotson is a really good wide receiver, and Nebraska held him in check. Pat Freiermuth might be the best tight end in the Big Ten. And still, with the game on the line, down 7 with 2 chances inside the red zone, Nebraska held Penn State without a touchdown. So credit the defense for that. They did just enough to get to that point they didn't, minus that 74-yard gain to Freiermuth, they didn't give up the big play. And that gave them the opportunity to get a red zone stop, and they did twice. So red zone struggles are a real thing for all offenses. Nebraska has struggled more than most so far this season, but if the Huskers are putting that same burden on Illinois on Saturday, they'll probably be in pretty good shape. Last on my list for what Nebraska needs to do this week is we're going to go to our old friend Bill Belichick for this one, and that is win the middle 8. It's a Bill Belichick joint, as I mentioned, as Spike Lee might put it. The Patriots' Emperor of Football put a special emphasis on the last 4 minutes of the first half and the first 4 minutes of the second half. That's how you get to 8. So the middle 8 minutes of the game is the way to think about this. Many football coaches, perhaps most football coaches, if they win the opening coin toss, defer the decision to take the ball or be on defense. They defer that to the second half for this very reason. If you wait until the second half and a game kind of unfolds like you'd expect it to, but few sudden change plays, maybe you get a first down or two and punt, like just with the way it works, with a clock that is ever ticking, you can hope to quote unquote double up on your opponent if you're taking the ball in the second half. And what that means is you've got a chance at having a positive drive, hopefully put points on the board right before halftime, and then get the ball back in the second half and do the same thing. And you could kind of feel this danger against Ohio State. Nebraska was still in that game. Buckeyes got a score right before halftime, came out in the second half and got another score. And that really, being able to quote unquote double up there, really put that game out of reach for Nebraska as a more than 3 touchdown underdog. You're looking at everything has to go about perfect. And that was one that decidedly went to the Buckeyes' liking. Nebraska hasn't been great in the middle 8, which probably won't come as a surprise to you. We got a ton of questions in the mailbag this week. It kind of has been the popular topic. Coaches are asked about it at press conferences. It comes up on call-in radio shows. What's the deal with Nebraska's second half struggles? And it's a tough question to answer. Frost employs a contrarian strategy, I think is the best way to put it, as it comes to those coin flip decisions. The Huskers are almost always taking the ball given the option. And because most teams defer, they also get the ball even when they don't win the toss. So with Coach Frost and staff, they've kind of made this a thing where they want the ball first. And it's a totally defensible strategy. I wrote a big story on this in the 2019 Hail Varsity Yearbook. If you happen to have that lying around, you can go back and look at that. But there's a lot of power in having a lead. And this is what makes that decision defensible in my mind. You get a lead, things become a little bit easier. Like your win percentage instantly goes up, of course. But also teams are more likely to commit turnovers when they trail. So if you can just get out front and maintain that lead, you're constantly putting some kind of unseen pressure on your opponent. And that's kind of the Frost approach. It's aggressive. And that's not a surprise. He's a pretty aggressive head coach in all aspects. But this might be kind of one of the most forward ways in that you can see it, even if you don't notice it before someone points it out. Like Nebraska takes the ball first for a reason. And it's not because the offense is so much better than the defense. It's because, in my opinion, I think they recognize the power of, hey, we're traditionally good at crafting an opening script, which is pretty undeniable at this point. Like, go back and look at Nebraska's first drives in games, and they move the ball on just about anyone. Like, they're tough to handle there. And then teams adjust, et cetera, which kind of crafts this whole narrative when you combine it with Nebraska's struggles in the third quarter of, they're great on the whiteboard on Tuesday, but you get into the game and what happens. I'm not sure that's totally it. I think some of this is kind of a residual effect of the decision Nebraska makes to take the ball most often. And it's a question of what you're willing to live with. Are you willing to, the price you pay for the opportunity to get on the board first is knowing that in some games, you're going to get doubled up. And it doesn't matter in terms of like the total number of possessions. You know, one of the most interesting things about football is you trade possessions. It's what makes turnovers such a big part of the game. Like if you forfeit one of those possessions earlier than you should without the exchange of field position, like it's killer. It really, really hurts you. And that's why, because it's a take turns type of game. Well, not type of game, by rule, it is a take turns game. So you got to keep that in mind. I think Frost and staff have kind of identified that, oh, hey, there's some advantages to getting on the board first, and you can, statistically prove those. It's a little bit of half dozen of one or 6 dozen of the other. But the key is you've got to be able to hold up in what Bill Belichick called the middle 8. And Nebraska has, well, overall, it has lost the middle 8 in the Frost era. Not by much, just by a little bit, but it's lost, and you can specifically divide it up. So in the first half, or the last 4 minutes of the first half of games since 2018, so all 27 games that have happened under Scott Frost as head coach, Nebraska's outscoring opponents 92-61. That's good. Like the yards per play are good, the success rate's good. They win that specific section of the game, and we're talking about pretty small sample sizes given the number of games that we're talking about. But they win that portion of it going into halftime. Started the second half, boy, did they lose it. Nebraska, through, again, 27 games under Scott Frost, has 1 touchdown in the first 4 minutes of the third quarter. Those are that's their only points. It's kind of, I was tallying it up. I was working with my spreadsheets and doing the whole thing, and I was like, that's it, I guess. Their opponents have scored 45 points over that stretch. So when you add it all up, when you look at the middle 8 as a whole, Nebraska's been outscored 106-99. That's a touchdown difference, but I think emotionally, in terms of momentum, that difference might actually be bigger than the pure points on the scoreboard show. So what that means is Nebraska's run almost 100 fewer plays over those first 4 minutes of the third quarter than the opponent. And that's by design. That's the price you pay for taking the ball first. You got to decide if you're willing to live with it, which obviously this coaching staff has, but it really puts a lot of pressure to make that first drive of the game meaningful, like and meaningful in the sense you've at least, well, no, at best want to get points, preferably a touchdown, but at least you better move the ball and flip field position. Like coming up empty on that first drive is really painful because Nebraska has chosen it as a strategy. They have chosen that, okay, we like our script. We know we can start fast. We're going to go out here and get points, and that's going to help us throughout, which it does if you do, in fact, get points. And Nebraska's done that in 2 games so far. Did it against Ohio State on the opening drive, did it against Penn State, and Penn State, through the help of the defense, that lead sort of snowballed a little bit and was really essential in Nebraska winning that game. But what you give up is there's just Nebraska doesn't have the ball a whole lot to start the second half. We talked in a previous episode about their struggles to force 3 and outs. That remains. Like, this is always going to be kind of a tough defense for 3 and outs, I think, barring a major talent upgrade. It's the sort of defense that's like, okay, if we're asking you to go 10, 12, 13 plays like they did against Penn State, we're pretty happy. That's fine, but teams are going to bleed off that whole first 4 minutes of the middle eight. And it matters so much because Sports Source Analytics, which is the company that provides the data, who knows how much they actually use it, but the data to the College Football Playoff Selection Committee in 2019 looked back at the previous 5 years of college football and found that the team that wins the middle eight is winning 76% of the time. Like it's huge. And when you stop and really think about it, you're like, okay, well, if you can control 8 minutes of the game, and really focus on it and be good at it. And Clemson is probably the best example of that in recent memory. Clemson tends to own the middle eight. Like, you're putting yourself in a pretty good position to win. Like 76% is basically the same or pretty close to the same as winning the efficiency battle, which is always the primary objective in a college football game. Like, the team that has a better success rate is probably winning 76, 77, 78% of the time. So you look at the middle eight, it's producing similar numbers. And Nebraska is too often, like, maybe 2020 is a bit of a different example, but certainly over the first 2 years, you would say that Nebraska's offense is its sharpest knife in the drawer. It's the best weapon that Nebraska has. And that's kind of how the program is built. If you're going to play this take the ball first strategy, you've got to be really confident in your ability to go downfield and get points. And Nebraska does okay on that front, but if you give those points up right again at the start of the second half, it's a little bit of a wash. And I think that's where the struggle is coming from. None of that fully explains Nebraska's struggles in the second half so far, particularly the third quarter. It's more of a symptom than a cause, perhaps, but it's at least worth considering. And the point is, for this game, in a game where you're a pretty heavy favorite, all things considered, certainly the heaviest favorite that Nebraska will be this year, when you're a 2-touchdown or more favorite, something has to happen outside of the norm for that game to go down to the wire. Something outside of the norm has to happen for a team like Illinois or whoever it may be to get a win. So that's why I put the middle eight here. It's kind of a big picture thing for Nebraska, but also if you're watching this game, you're like, well, Nebraska jumped out to a 14-0 lead, and then Illinois cut it to 7 right before half, got the ball back, came down and got another field goal, and it's 14-10 or whatever the score may be. It'll probably be more high scoring than that, I'm guessing. But either way, you're cutting into a lead. Like, that's a problem for Nebraska. That's something that is unfortunately the norm for the Huskers so far through 2.5 seasons, but is something against an opponent you're, by all accounts, better than, is something that keeps them in the game. When, you could dominate all of the time leading up to that middle eight and all of the time leading after. And if things just kind of break the right way, if you miss a field goal or something happens like that, you go for a 4th down, when you're on the opponent's half of the field and don't get it. Like, these are the things that lead to games being closer than they probably actually are on paper. So that's always kind of a key. You can look for those individual areas where that might be the case in games like these. And in this particular game, I think the middle eight is going to be a pretty big one for Nebraska. That'll wrap another episode of the I-80 Preview Podcast. Mentioned this last week, but if you have any questions, comments, concerns, great Thanksgiving recipes that I need to try, you can reach me at i80@hailvarsity.com via email. I am also on Twitter. I don't tweet much anymore. I'm getting too old for that. Like, nobody cares what I think, but I am always happy to to have discussions, particularly football related discussions there. So you can reach me at Brandon L. Vogel on Twitter. Would love to hear from you. Like I said, if you guys have any questions, something you want me to look at as we preview these games, I'm always happy to do it. Honestly, like, helps me out a lot, because you don't have to kind of examine every possible outcome, every possible facet of the game, though I'll probably do that anyway. But just having a starting point and having something that somebody's interested in is pretty helpful. So, as always, if you like the show, give it a rating and tell your friends about it. Check out the rest of the shows on the Hail Varsity Network. Read our work. Consider a subscription. Holiday season is, well, it's basically here at this point. So if there's someone in your life who's a big Husker fan and they want what I believe is a pretty good magazine and pretty great coverage across all platforms, think about Hail Varsity for that. We'll have some specials coming up on subscriptions around Thanksgiving and Black Friday, because that's what you got to do, of course. So keep an eye out for those. You can find all of those on hailvarsity.com. Via Twitter is probably even the best way to do that, but you can follow us on Instagram. We're on TikTok. Deputy Editor Aaron Sorensen has done a great job in terms of the TikTok content, so give that a look if that's your cup of tea. And thanks for listening. We'll be back next week to preview the Huskers' next game and go from there.
A Hurrdat Media Production.